local bar association criminal law procedure section, the president of that, that has an active criminal practice, and one thing he will not do is to take any fee to provide proceeds of narcotics. Be very careful about that.
Okay, you want to call it and get it going?
Yeah. You object, I'll be the judge, I'll rule on objections, so just act as if you have a genuine judge here. Call code number 23179, State of Texas, Inspector Alvarez. State, you may proceed.
May it please the court, counsel, jury panel. My name is Sharon Pierce. I'm an assistant Travis County attorney. That means I'm a lawyer that works for Travis County, and I'm here today representing Travis County and the state of Texas. This is the defense counsel, Mr. Gerry Morris, and the defendant is Victor Alvarez. He's seated to Mr. Morris's right. I don't have a co-counsel today, and I don't believe Mr. Morris is either, but should someone join us and sit at the counsel table, there will probably be people that work in our offices and are helping us with the trial.
Ms. Pierce, you'll have a half hour, I'm sorry, you'll have a half hour, so I can warn you about 5 minutes before.
Yes, Your Honor. Do any of you know anybody that I've just named, the defendant, the defense counsel, myself, anybody else who might work in the Travis County Attorney's Office or the District Attorney's Office? This is a driving while intoxicated case. Victor Alvarez, who's the defendant, has been charged with that criminal offense. And that's why you have all been called here today to possibly be selected as a juror in the trial of this case. And I need to ask you some questions about how you feel about driving while intoxicated and matters related to those issues so that we can choose, both the defense counsel and I, a fair and impartial jury to listen to the evidence in this case and then find either the guilt or the innocence of the defendant, Victor Alvarez. And I'm not asking you questions because I want to embarrass you or make you feel uncomfortable. I'm asking you those questions because I want to give this defendant a fair trial. That's what my job is as a prosecutor. I'm not here to convict this defendant. I'm here on behalf of the state to find the truth with all of you. I've had an opportunity to review the evidence before coming into trial today, and the questions I'm going to ask you are questions that relate to some of that evidence and your feelings generally about driving while intoxicated. I want you to know there are not any right or wrong answers. This is a sensitive subject. I've had someone in my family who's had a problem with drinking, and I realize that it's something that everybody probably will have strong feelings about. So I want to assure you that you don't need to feel worried, or you don't need to try to find the right answer that I might want to hear or that the defense attorney wants to hear. Just tell me really what you're feeling. And that's all we're really looking for. So I want to encourage everybody to do that. I guess really one of the simplest questions to ask to find out how you feel about a case like this is if any of you have ever been involved in a DWI case yourselves or know someone who has been. Mr. Daly, have you ever been involved in a DWI case?
No, I haven't.
How about you, Mr. Bird?
Very good.
How did you feel about it?
I thought it was a sham, really.
Why did you feel it was a shame?
I wasn't drunk.
You were a defendant in the DWI case.
Not really.
What were you?
Well, I was arrested. The officer thought I was drunk, but I was released the same night. I was charged with being foul.
Why did you feel like it was a shame? What about it made you feel that way?
Well, the police officer just took me in because he didn't like the way I was acting.
How were you acting?
Well, he pulled me over, said I was leaving, and I don't know what the problem was. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. I may have been a little sleepy or something. But and when I asked him what the problem was, it just got real hostile and things deteriorated from there.
Do you feel like you were unfairly brought into the jail by the police officer?
Yeah, I think that I was a college student and just was looking for something.
Anything? And you have pretty strong feelings about that, don't you?
Yes, I do.
Feel like that police officer was doing the wrong thing.
I don't think he was doing his job.
He was just picking on you because you were a college student.
Right.
And I appreciate the fact that you've been honest about it. I'm sure it's difficult to talk about it, having ever come in contact with the police. Don't you feel like that experience with that police officer, and you have pretty strong feelings about it, would make it difficult for you to listen to the testimony of a police officer in this trial and listen fairly to that police officer?
I don't think so.
Okay, why don't you think you have a problem with it?
Well, I just think it was that particular police officer, not every police officer.
What about that particular police officer do you think made him act that way?
He's probably late, he's probably tired, been out a long time to work on it. These things happen.
Well, do you feel like police officers are generally honest?
Yeah.
So you think this was just one bad apple,
Or one bad night.
one bad night for an otherwise honest police officer? Outside of feeling that the police officer was having a bad night, was there anything else about that experience, going to the jail or being handcuffed, that you thought was unfair?
Not really.
It was just a police officer?
Right.
Now, there's going to be testimony in this trial from a police officer, in fact, 3 police officers, about what happened on the night that Victor Alvarez was arrested and charged with driving while intoxicated. And I believe evidence is going to be that one particular police officer talked with Victor Alvarez and observed his driving and made a decision that he was intoxicated based on the things that he saw. Now, think hard about this, because I want Victor Alvarez to get a fair trial. And so does the defense attorney. Don't you think that these feelings that you've had about a police officer in the past, in connection with the driving while intoxicated charge against you, would make it almost impossible for you to listen without wondering what that police officer, maybe it was his bad night, like it was your police officer's bad night? That you couldn't listen without some bias towards his testimony?
I think I could listen to what he was saying, judge that myself.
Wouldn't you be a little biased, maybe thinking to yourself, hey, maybe he was having a bad night?
I might think that, I probably would question whether he, the events happened as he thought they did.
Don't you think you might be biased towards him just because he had a uniform on?
No,
He might be having that bad night.
I don't think so.
I think so. You think you could listen to all the evidence real fairly?
I think so.
Well, you stated in your case that the officer had mentioned that you had been weaving when you were driving. Have you ever seen anybody who was intoxicated and driving on the road?
Yes, I have.
What kind of driving were they doing?
Just going from side to side, just all over the road.
Would you say it was pretty bad driving that you saw?
That was scary.
Scary. Would you, in order to convict someone of driving while intoxicated, would you require the state to show that kind of bad driving, that real dangerous weaving type of driving?
No, I don't think there's.
Do you think that there might be other things, other actions and behavior that could show that you were intoxicated other than that kind of driving? What kinds of things do you think might also show that you were intoxicated?
Just not being able to stand up or people can get in the car and drive real slow and drive fairly straight, following the lines on the edge of the road or something like that. When you drunk, you have to see the person and look at them and just see how they act.
Okay, you bring up a real good point, and that is that there's not generally one thing that you can point at and say, that makes this person intoxicated. Wouldn't you agree with that? Or there's a number of things added together. Would you say that's true? And once you get all of those things and look at them, you can determine whether someone's intoxicated. You think that's the case?
I think so.
What things about somebody's behavior, say outside of the driving, would you think might make you think they were intoxicated?
Well, how they talk, how they move, just how they carry themselves, maybe an odor.
Ms. Ford, would you agree with Mr. Bird that how they talk, how they move, those sorts of things might be an indication of intoxication?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Let's take for an example, somebody's mood. Let's say they cry. Would you think that might be an indication that they were intoxicated?
Well, I think crying can mean a lot of things.
Can it mean that you might be intoxicated?
I guess it could.
Have you ever heard the phrase, you know, someone was crying in your beer?
Yes, I have.
And what do you think that means?
Well, I've never really known what it meant, except someone was crying in their beer,
Right?
right?
You think that alcohol might make you depressed and maybe make you lose control over your emotions that you might otherwise have ability to control?
I do think it causes you to be less inhibited, and if you felt sad, I guess you would express it more.
Do you think if you were intoxicated, you might lose your balance
Oh yeah, I think that definitely goes.
with being intoxicated?
Yeah.
What other types of things occur to you?
Your speech gets slurry, and I think you can't see as well either. You have trouble focusing, and sometimes your eyes get bloodshot.
Anything else?
That's about it.
Mr. Burleson? Okay, you heard what Mr. Bird and Ms. Ford said about signs of intoxication. Can you think of any other ones that maybe they hadn't mentioned?
No, it's not maybe
Do you think that crying might be, like crying in your beer might be a sign that you're intoxicated?
Well, I don't know, maybe you're drinking your beer because you're sad. I don't know which, chicken or the egg came first. I guess maybe if you're drunk, you can be a little more nervous.
Do you think that if you're intoxicated, you have less control over your emotions like this?
Probably so.
Have you ever been involved in a DWI case?
I am.
Do you know anyone who has? Have you ever had a friend who was, say, the victim of a drunk driver?
No.
And that brings me to a point that recently, I think, in the last few years, there's been a lot more information about drunk drivers and the victims of drunk drivers. I know here in Austin, a young college girl was...
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained.
And some of you may be aware of that case. And I
Yeah,
want to find out...
The objection was sustained.
Objection is that you're objecting.
The objection was sustained, and there'll be no more comment on it.
How do you, any of you, and I just asked you to volunteer, feel about drunk drivers just generally? And say Mothers Against Drunk Drivers, that group, generally what that group represents. Mr. Daly?
Well, I'm a devout Christian, and I think anybody who drinks is a sinner. So, I agree with what they do. I don't think drunk people should be on the road. If they are, maybe the penalties ought to be more severe for people who drink. I don't know.
Does your feeling that drinking is a sin come from the fact that you're a devout Christian?
Yeah.
And I don't want to embarrass you or make you feel uncomfortable talking about your religious beliefs, because that's one of the things that this board order is designed specifically to do, and that's to find out those feelings that people have in their background that might not otherwise be obvious. And you stated that you just don't think people should drink, period?
Well, I think they're sinners if they drink.
Okay. Now, I think that the judge in this case will give you a set of instructions, and I can't tell you exactly what those instructions will be, but they will be generally about the law of driving while intoxicated. And all of us have backgrounds, beliefs, religious feelings, very strongly held ones, that you can't forget about, and nobody wants you to forget about them. But what we do need you to do is follow the instructions that the judge will give you about the law. And the instructions that I believe the judge is going to give you in this case is that it's against the law to drive and be intoxicated when you're driving. It's not going to say it's against the law to drive and be drunk. It's going to say, if you find from the evidence that the defendant was driving and he was intoxicated, then you must find him guilty. Now, Mr. Daly, I'm sure that you also feel like it's important to follow the law. Would you agree with me on that? I think that is part of my background. It's one of the things that they talk about in church. You should follow the laws of the country that you're in.
It's part of my background too.
And if the judge instructed you that you can only find the defendant guilty, and you should find the defendant guilty if you find from all the evidence beyond a reasonable doubt the defendant was driving under while intoxicated, could you follow that law?
Yes, I think I could.
Is there anybody here that couldn't follow that law for whatever reason? Anybody feel uncomfortable following that law? I haven't told you a lot about what the law says, but I've used the term intoxicated. And in Texas, that means three things. That means that someone has lost the normal use of his physical faculties, or that he's lost the normal use of his mental faculties, or that the defendant has an alcohol concentration of 0.10 or greater. And in Texas, the law is if you are any one of those three things that I've outlined, any one of those three things has happened, then you are intoxicated. And all you need is one. If you have two or three, you've got the whole shooting match. But I want each one of you to understand that it just takes one, and that's what the term intoxicated means. And in a DWI case, there are really usually only two issues. The first issue was the defendant driving, and that sometimes becomes an issue. I don't believe it will be in this case. And the second issue is, was he driving and intoxicated? I believe the biggest issue in this case is whether the defendant was intoxicated. And the law that I've told you the judge will give you that definition, whether he's lost the normal use of his physical or mental faculties, or he has an alcohol concentration of 0.10 or better. Is there anybody who just doesn't like that law? Just think that's law is wrong, doesn't want to enforce it? Anybody feel that way? Ms. Ford, I saw you smile.
No, I don't feel that way.
Okay, do you feel like it's a good law?
Yeah.
Why do you think we have a law like that?
Well, that anyone who drives drunk is a danger to himself and anyone else on the road, and it's just a way of protecting the citizens from bodily injury. Yeah.
I think Texas has also got another law that says it's against the law to drink when you're under the age of 21. What do you think you have that law?
I'm not real sure the reason, but I suspect it has to do with a high correlation between young people drinking and committing crimes or driving, erratically or something. I mean, there must be some good reason for it. I don't know what it is.
You think it might be because young people ability to police themselves is maybe not as great as an older person's ability?
Yeah, I definitely think that.
That their judgment might not be quite as wise as someone who's over 21? I think that might be the case.
Yes.
That their experience with alcohol might make it less able for them to know when they've had enough to drink to drive home?
That's probably a real good reason for it.
How about you, Mr. Burleson? Do you feel like somebody who's under 21 doesn't have that experience with drinking that can tell him, 2 drinks is my limit, I better not drink anymore?
Well, if you're asking me the abstract, I think 21 is probably an arbitrary age. I don't know that there's any magic about being 21 years old.
Mm-hmm. But do you think a younger person might have their age would make them less able to know How much is too much?
Might, if you ask might, yeah, might,
How about you,
not necessarily.
Mr. Burke?
What's that?
Maybe I'm sorry, the young age of somebody, if say they were 20, 19, 20 years old, they might not have been out in the world enough to know, I can have these many beers and no more, and I better call a cab at that point. That might be the case.
I've seen more 40-year-old girls, 19.
Well, I know everybody has their trouble. Has anybody ever taken a drink and gotten in their car?
Or
Gotten in their car, one drink and driven their car home. Has anybody ever done that? And you're shaking your head no.
No, I haven't.
Do you drink at
No,
all?
I don't.
Okay. This is kind of a personal question, but why don't you drink?
That's a complicated question. I come from a religious tradition where drinking is not, but unlike the other fellow, I don't necessarily think it's sinful. I think that's everybody's decision. I grew up in a family where we didn't drink, and so I just kind of never did acquire the habit. But I don't think it's immoral.
If the judge instructed you about the laws I've already explained, could you apply that law?
Sure.
Even though you don't feel like people should drink?
Sure. And I didn't say I didn't feel like people should drink.
Or that you have?
I personally choose not to drink.
Have you ever had a drink?
I did in high school. I tasted some, but other than that, I haven't.
Did you ever feel like that the drink that you had back in high school, did it affect you at all? Did you feel any difference from drinking it?
I just had one drink, and I guess I felt a little bit, but
Why do you think people should drink when they're at work?
depends on what they do. Some people need to.
Why do you think people generally don't drink when they're at work?
Well, if they're, a doctor or working in heavy machinery or something like that, I guess it may affect their ability to do their job.
Yeah, and it maybe affects their mental processes or their physical abilities to do the
Yeah,
job.
I've heard some people say that it enhances some of their abilities to think or something like that too, so I don't know if it's always the case.
Okay. Why do you think it might enhance your ability to do it?
Why do I think so? I don't know. I don't drink, so I don't know. But I know that some people, before they do something, like go on stage or something, they take a drink, and it makes them more comfortable or something like that.
Do you think that any of those enhancing abilities might apply to driving a car?
Probably not.
You think probably if you're drinking and driving a car, it's not a good idea?
Probably not, right.
Can you ever think when it might be a good idea?
To drink and drive? No, not really.
Okay, now both you and Mr. Daly have stated that you just don't think it's a good idea to drink. Do you think you're going to have any trouble, given what you told me about applying the law and sitting in judgment, which is what you'll be doing, for someone who I believe the evidence is going to show did drink? Mr. Daly, do you think you're going to have a problem doing that?
No, I don't think I had trouble.
Okay. How about you, Mr. Brooks?
Any trouble applying the law if he was intoxicated? No.
Okay. And Ms. Ford and Mr. Bird, y'all both indicated that you had a drink and driven. Is that correct? Do either one of y'all feel like you've ever had a drink and driven when you probably shouldn't have, maybe when your physical or mental faculties were impaired? Ms. Ford?
Well, I usually try not to do that if I know I'm going to be driving. And if I do drink and I feel like I can't drive, I let my husband drive.
Okay. So you recognize it,
Yeah, I
that
try not to do that.
have that designated driver, and sometimes that's cab driver.
Well, actually, I've never had to call a cab, but I would, I guess. I'd rather do that. But
Do you think the fact that you've had a few drinks and may have driven a car, whether you were intoxicated or not, do you think that feeling and that knowledge would affect your ability to sit in judgment of the defendant in this cause?
well, what do you mean? I don't understand. I mean,
Well, I think there might be the feeling that, well, I've done it too. How can I sit here and convict this man of something that I've done?
Let's see, well, I don't know, I don't feel like I've ever driven when I've been drunk. I don't think I would feel that way if he was drunk.
How about you, Mr. Bird? Have you ever had a little bit too much to drink and gotten in your car and driven? Do you think that you'd have any trouble if the evidence was beyond a reasonable doubt that this defendant was intoxicated when he was driving? Do you think you'd have any trouble sitting in judgment on that? Ms. Ford, I've got this piece of paper, I've got those names on it. I filled out a little bit about you from the sheets that you filled out when you sent in your juror cards. And I've noticed that you've got an attorney as a husband, and I've got an attorney that's a husband too. So,
What does yours work?
and I wondered if you tell me where your husband is.
Well, he works for the AG's office,
In what section?
the enforcement section.
And that is criminal law, isn't it?
Well, he represents the state in federal habeas things.
Do you think that the pillow talk that y'all might have, or what you might know from your husband, would affect your ability to listen to the evidence in this case?
Well, he's never ever said anything about DWI. I mean, this just isn't even anything like what he does.
Okay.
Appears you have
The buzzer is ringing, and so I want to talk to y'all about really about 2 or 3 more things. In this case, the evidence is going to show that the defendant took a breath test. Does anybody who doesn't know what that is? Has anybody ever heard of it? Is there anybody who just feels like, for whatever reason, that breath test is no good? Mr. Berg? If the state gave you evidence that the defendant had taken a breath test and failed it, would you disregard that evidence?
I don't know how I would weigh that evidence, but I tend to not believe that it's accurate.
If you heard testimony from an expert about what that breath test meant and how that whole process works, how the machine works, and you heard 2 experts, one that told you the theory of it and one that told you how that actual test given to this particular defendant works, which one of those 2 experts do you think you might believe more, Mr. Ferguson?
It depends. I think it depends on the individual credibility. I couldn't tell you beforehand. But obviously, if all things being equal, the one who tells me about this specific test.
How about you, Ms. Ford?
I think I'd probably feel the same way. A lot would depend on how I react to the people.
I want to take just the last few minutes to talk about the rights of this defendant. And he is presumed innocent. He does not have to offer any testimony. And there may be reasons why he doesn't offer testimony. He may be nervous because he's from another country. He may have an accent. He may speak another language as his first language. But because he's presumed innocent, I want you all to understand that that doesn't mean, and he doesn't take the stand, I don't know if he will or he won't, but that doesn't mean you get to fill in the blanks or you get to make excuses for him. As a juror, you're supposed to listen to the evidence at the trial. Does everyone understand that? Anybody think that should be the case? And also, the presumption of innocence, which we've all heard about probably, doesn't mean that you have to believe everything the defendant tells you. You get to weigh his testimony just like anyone else's testimony, just like the testimony of a police officer, just like the testimony of a friend or witness to this event. You think about their motives and what they're saying, and then you determine whether you believe their story is truthful or not. You're not required to believe it because he's presumed innocent. Does anybody not understand that? Anybody think that shouldn't be the case? Just raise your hand if you do. And finally, this is a criminal case, and that means their burden of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt. And you may have heard that on TV from Perry Mason. Probably just heard it generally. Now, beyond a reasonable doubt makes it sound like it's a 50-foot wall that we've got to jump over like a superwoman. That's not what it means. There's no definition in Texas of what reasonable doubt means. I would suggest to you that it does not mean beyond a shadow of doubt. It means that after you've listened to all of the evidence, you've watched all of the witnesses, you've looked at their demeanor, thought about their motives, and you've weighed it all, if you have a reason to doubt the defendant is guilty, then you must find him innocent. That doesn't mean that I've got to prove beyond any doubt that he is guilty. It means a reasonable doubt. And when you hear me say that, you may think in your mind, gosh, how can the state ever do that? Well, I assure you the state does it every day, and it will do it in this case. Thank all of you for being here. I appreciate your time and attention, and should you be selected to serve on the jury, I look forward to working with you in the trial.
Pass?
Got it. As Ms. Pierce told you, my name is Gerry Morris. I represent Victor Alvarez, who's accused of DWI. How many of you know what DWI is? Or do you know it's a criminal offense? Do you know how severe a criminal offense it is? You're not going to be asked to assess punishment in this case. You might be amazed to know that if you go down to a local hardware store and pick out a television that costs $700 and you decide that you want to walk out with that television and not pay for it, then the most that can happen to you is 1 year in jail. If you're convicted of DWI, twice that can happen to you, 2 years in jail. DWI is a very serious offense. The reason I bring that to your attention is I think some people may have the conception that it's something like a traffic offense. It's not. It's a criminal offense. Mr. Alvarez stands charged with an offense that could result in a loss of his liberty for up to 2 years. Now, when someone is charged with a criminal offense, they have a right to a trial. They have a right to plead not guilty and let someone decide the issue of guilt or innocence. He has a choice of either having a judge here decide that, or having 6 people from the community decide that. Mr. Alvarez has chosen to leave it in your hands. Now, how many of you have ever been accused of something you didn't do? Now, I'm not talking about a criminal offense, but just anything from, I think just about everybody has at some time or the other. And at some point in time, somebody made a decision about whether you had actually done that. Well, that's sort of what you're going to do here, except it's a little more structured. We have very specific charges. But I want you to ask yourself just a minute, what kind of person did you want to make that decision in your case? You couldn't have your best friend. So who were you looking for? Who did you hope made that decision? You hoped that someone made that decision who wouldn't look at you and make their mind up before they heard your story. You wanted somebody fair and impartial, just like Ms. Pierce said. And that's what we're looking for in this case. We're looking for 6 people who can listen to all the evidence and not make their mind up as they look at Mr. Alvarez or as they hear what Ms. Pierce has to say, what I have to say, but listen to all the evidence. And then after they've heard all the evidence, make that decision. And you know, there's nothing damning about in a particular instance being prejudiced. I think we all are in some situations. You know, I may be in a particular situation because of some experience I've had in my life, and you may too. I've got to ask you to do something for me though, and this is real important in a criminal case because nobody wants to send somebody to jail or some other consequence unless they're guilty of what happened. So I've got to ask you to do this. If you discover during the course of our conversation here that there's some reason that you can't be fair and impartial in this case, please tell me. Because you don't have to serve on the jury. And there's nothing wrong with telling me that. And if you are biased or prejudiced, as Ms. Pierce said, or there's some reason why you can't be fair and impartial, not only are you legally disqualified from serving on the jury, but you shouldn't do it because it's just not fair. Now, this is the hard part for me because the only way that we can really discover what you think about this particular incident is to talk. And you think it's awkward sitting where you are, you ought to try standing where I am. So humor me a little bit and talk to me, okay? I'm going to ask you some questions, and I'm going to be real interested in knowing what you think about some things that I'm going to ask. I'm not going to really suggest an answer to you. I want to hear what you have to say. You're very forthcoming with Ms. Pierce, and I hope that you feel comfortable in being that way with me too. First thing I want to talk about is, I don't want to save it for the last because I think it's the most important thing that we're going to talk about, is the burden of proof in a criminal case. In a criminal case, the person or the entity that is bringing the charges, is prosecuting the charges, is the state of Texas. State of Texas versus Victor Alvarez. Mr. Alvarez has had me as his attorney. The state of Texas has Mrs. Pierce. Mrs. Pierce is paid by the state of Texas or released by the county. You're going to hear police officers in here testifying. They're paid by a governmental entity, by University of Texas, which of course is part of the state of Texas. You're going to see an expert come in here and testify about a breath test machine, who's paid by the state of Texas. The breath test machine was bought by the state of Texas. You're going to see a lot of people come in here and testify. They're being paid while they testify by the state of Texas. How many of you think that Mr. Alvarez has those kind of resources? Do you ever think that he can really match all that? It started out with pretty big, the scale was pretty well tipped when you started out. I think we all have to agree that the more resources you have, the better chance you've got of getting your point across. Well, we balance that out in a criminal case because the burden of proof in a criminal case is on the state. And it is a high burden of proof. I'm not going to try to water it down for you. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt is a high burden of proof. Mr. Daly, what do you think about that? Do you think that's a good idea to have it that high?
Well, I think it's needed high. You got the scale stiff the way you say that they are tipped. I don't want to send anybody to jail that was against it.
Well, don't take my word for it. Do you think they're tipped like that? Do you think that that's the way it is, and that's the way it appears to you? With all those resources, you think the scales are pretty well tipped?
Well, I think you've got a good road to hope.
Mr. Byrd, am I reading that right? How do you feel about that?
Well, I think it's a good idea. If someone's guilty, they ought to prove it.
All right. Ms. Ford, I was impressed with your candor on board a few minutes ago. How do you feel?
Well, the way you described it, the state does have a lot more resources, but I guess I wonder if perhaps some of them aren't wasted, because a lot of times the person representing the state might also be doing, a whole lot of other cases, and you might just have a few.
Well, you've got a husband that works with the state, so you probably have some personal experience on that, right?
Yeah, I know that they work really hard and they have lots and lots of things to attend to, and, so that even though they have what seems like the state behind them, it might really,
Well,
the money might not really be that impressive. What they can put into the case.
well, let's suppose just for a minute that I have nothing else to do. Do you think that I'm capable of being a breathalyzer expert, a police officer, a prosecutor, and all the other witnesses that you'll hear here today? Okay.
I don't think you can muster all those people to come in here, but I think you can put a lot of energy and time into your case that the state probably can't.
Well, even given the absurd presumption that this is all I have to do, do you still think that we're starting out deep?
No, certainly not equal.
Do you think that the burden of proof then, being as high as it is, and it is high, do you think that's a good idea?
Yeah, I do, but for another reason.
Or what's your reason?
Well, basically, I just think that it's better to let people go who've done something and put someone in jail or worse, kill them for something happening. So I think it has to be that way.
Thank you. Sir, how do you feel about the burden of proof?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't understand exactly what all that means, the ins and outs of it, but
Well, it might cheer you up to know that lawyers been trying to find that for a long time, and the Spirit said we haven't come up with anything either, so that may not surprise you.
Well, it doesn't at all. I don't know, I see the same problem she does, but I come out a little different. I think maybe there are too many, I think, well, while I give you the fact that you start out in different places, I think the burden of proof probably tips it a little bit too much. I think there are a lot of people who, because of maybe the burden of proof or other legal technicalities, are on the street that shouldn't be there.
Okay,
I think we're letting a lot slip through.
Let me ask you this. Do you think that it's desirable to put a few in that aren't guilty so that doesn't happen?
Maybe so, in the overall scheme. I don't know.
Okay.
I think that, but when I say that, before you start thinking that I'm going to be a bad juror, that's not our system, and I recognize it's not.
No, that's the Soviet Union system, as a matter of fact.
Well, it's others too. There are other systems that you can imagine that would employ a little different balancing, and I just would have to favor that, but I recognize that we don't live in that.
Okay. And the next question I want to ask you is, understanding as you do, are you willing to enforce that? Because if you don't, I mentioned the Soviet Union. You might be surprised to know that if you read the Soviet Constitution, there are more express rights in the Soviet Constitution than there are in the United States Constitution. But does anybody really believe Soviet people have more rights or enjoy more rights? And the simple reason is they're there in the Constitution, but the government doesn't pay attention to them.
They're a heck of a lot safer than we are too.
Safer from what, sir?
Crime. You don't hear a lot of crime.
You don't hear much of anything from over there, do you, sir? How many of you agree that you're better off in the Soviet Union, just out of curiosity? Okay. All right, moving right along. One thing that I think obviously we should be concerned about in this case is we're wanting fair and impartial jurors. And it's going to come out in testimony that Mr. Alvarez is from Nicaragua, Nicaraguan student, and he was with several other people in Nicaragua. Nicaragua is in the newspapers now. And one thing about the Nicaraguan situation is everybody has an opinion on it. One thing that I can remember reading about when I was in high school, I guess, is how German people were treated in World War I, about how couldn't call hamburger meat anymore, et cetera, et cetera. I think we're a long way beyond that now. And I think that if there is any prejudice at all towards Mr. Alvarez because of that, something he has nothing to do with, it's very subtle. But I want to ask you, Mr. David, how do you feel about that? How can Mr. Alvarez get a fair trial with all the publicity that's going on from the Nicaraguan situation? Can he get a fair trial from you?
I think so. I don't particularly think that where he's from has anything to do with what he's charged with, anything like that. So I think I can get a fair trial.
What about you, Mr. Burke?
Yeah, a fair trial.
Yes, I wouldn't have any problem with that.
In fact, it's probably the most American thing we can do is give someone a fair trial from a country that we're not on real good terms with right now. I think would you agree with me on that?
Is he over here legally?
Yes. Now, we were talking a while ago about police officer testimony. There are going to be a lot of police officers testifying in this case about what they saw. The officer that arrested Mr. Alvarez. Now, these are not the kind of police officers you're probably used to seeing. These are not the ones that would come if you call. These are University of Texas police officers that basically what they do is they patrol around campus, and probably the majority of people they handle are university students. They're nonetheless police officers. Now growing up, my mother was a nurse and worked in a hospital for 40 years, and she admittedly got to where every time I didn't look just right, I was sick because she saw sick people every day, all day long, and everybody started looking sick to her. You think something like that might happen to a police officer that goes out every day and arrests people all day long, and maybe even arrests a lot of people for DWI? You think that maybe it could happen that he gets kind of into that mold or that rut, and it just doesn't really look as careful as he ought to? What do you think?
I think he can get cynical at times and maybe be overzealous in his enforcement and not tend to believe other people, think other people are against him, things like that.
Mr. Burt, do you think that may be what happened to you?
Definitely.
Ms. Ford, what do you think about that?
I've never really thought about it. I guess it's possible. It depends on how committed they are to not letting that happen, I guess.
Mr. Burleson, do you have an opinion?
Well, yeah, a little bit. It seems to me I'd think that just because you're around it a lot, it would make you better at recognizing it rather than worse. To me, I get to the opposite conclusion.
You think you might be better at recognizing it?
Well, if your mom was a nurse and she was around sick kids all day, it seems to me that if you were well, then she'd be able to know you're well. I mean,
Well, I never met my mom. That's not the way it worked. But
I don't know that being around it all the time necessarily makes you not be able to recognize it.
Okay. One thing I want to ask you, Ms. Burleson, you've listed your student and your occupation or place of employment in the city of Boston.
Yeah.
I'm a little bit confused by that.
Well, I work part-time.
What do you do for the city?
In an internship, it's a paid internship at City Council.
Okay. Who do you work for down there?
All of whoever needs research done.
I see. Okay. We talked a while ago, talked with Ms. Pierce about drinking in general. And I think, I grew up in an area where people had strong opinions about that. And Mr. Daly, you expressed that you had a religious conviction that drinking was a sin.
That's right.
Mr. Alvarez does not have that same conviction, religious conviction. And a lot of people believe as you do, and a lot of people believe as he does. Let me ask you, what, if anything, do you think ought to happen to him because he drinks?
Well, what happens to him is his business, but as far as what the law provides, well, they don't have to follow that. In fact, he was found to be driving while intoxicated. I know a lot of people don't see things the way I do. I live that.
Well, as you look at him today, and again, keeping in mind what I said a while ago about it, it's going to have to be you that blows the whistle on yourself if you really don't think that you all serve on the jury. Looking at him today, how do you feel about him? Do you think he's guilty?
No, I mean, he's presumed innocent. He told me that.
Right, but I'm not really asking you what we told you. Just how do you feel? Do you feel like that because he didn't think like you do, or not because he doesn't share your belief that you're more likely to convict?
I don't know. I don't think that I'm more likely to convict him. That's just, he drinks, that's his business. I don't like it. I don't like to do that. That's my business.
Keeping in mind the seriousness of the situation here, do you feel qualified to serve on this jury?
I think so. Of course, what I think doesn't matter.
No, it matters. No, sir, not at all. What I think probably as the day wears on, you'll think is increasingly insignificant. What you think is paramount importance here.
I think I could give him a fair trial.
Mr. Burleson, you expressed too that you were not a drinker. How do you, Mr. Alvarez, as he sits here today, knowing he's a drinker, does that affect your perception of him right now? Does that make you slant one way or the other right now on how you think this case ought to come out?
Well, I guess it makes me slant a little bit. I mean, I personally think drinking is unwise, and I've chosen not to do it, so I guess I would have to say that I consider his decision to do it was unwise.
Okay. Do you have an idea based on that of how this case ought to come out at this point?
You know.
Do you think that you can be fair and impartial? Now, again, I have to rely on you here, and have to rely on, I suppose, what I might say is your sense of duty as a citizen, and knowing that you shouldn't serve on this jury unless you can be fair and impartial. Do you think you can be fair and impartial?
I think you can.
Okay. The state's going to introduce evidence about an intoxicator. And as Ms. Pierce told you, one way that a person can be intoxicated under Texas law is if their blood alcohol level is 0.10 or above. That would be a definition of 0.10. Well, intoxicators, you'll find out from the expert, doesn't measure the amount of alcohol in the blood. It measures the amount of alcohol in the breath, and then attempts to figure out by a formula how that relates to the amount of alcohol in the blood. It's a machine. I don't understand it. Does anybody here have any knowledge of how intoxilizer works?
I don't think it works.
Okay. You may hear some testimony from somebody that agrees with you. Would you agree with me? Is it unreasonable to assume that with a complicated machine, as you're going to find out who the intoxilizer is, that at least if you're going to operate the machine, it's important to the validity of the result that you at least follow the instructions? That you at least do what the instruction book says you're supposed to do before you take that reading? Anybody have any disagreement with that? Okay. Will you listen, Mr. Daly, to the expert on the intoxilizer and whatever evidence we put on, and keep an open mind until all that's in?
Yes.
Mr. Byrd?
I'll listen.
Okay. Ms. Ford?
Sure.
Mr. Burleson, do you have any notion at this point about how intoxilizer works?
About how it works?
Right.
No, I don't.
But you're kind of curious at this point about how it works.
Yeah.
Okay, well, you're going to hear a lot about it.
Okay.
And will you keep an open mind until we finish? All right. Spears talked to you about the defendant, the accused in a criminal case, having the right to not take the witness stand. There are all sorts of reasons why the defendant might not take the witness stand. She mentioned a few. I'll go over them again. But generally, let's put yourself in this position of, let's bring yourself up to the witness stand and think about having to tell 6 people that you don't know what you were doing on a particular evening. That's going to bother you enough already, at least it would me. Now let's add another factor. Let's suppose that those 6 people were judging you as to whether or not you would lose your liberty for up to 2 years. And let's suppose that you know that what they're judging you on is how you look and sound. You think you might be a little reluctant to take the witness stand under those conditions, knowing that you just didn't sound right, that might be interpreted as bad for you, you might lose your own case. Especially someone, let's think for a minute that all this is happening to you in a country that is not your homeland, and that you're testifying in a language that's not your first language. Pretty heavy thought, isn't it? Mr. Daly, if the accused doesn't take the stand in this case, are you going to hold it against him?
No. I don't think so.
Don't think you will?
There's no reason to.
Well, how do you feel about that? How do you feel about what I just said? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. You can't communicate your side of the story. I'll be best to sit down.
How do you feel generally if I just tell you the accused is not going to take a stand in his own defense? Do you question that?
I think it could make you wonder a little bit if he's really innocent, why he's not up there telling us that he is, but, I got to follow the law. Or the law says he's innocent.
Are you going to, is that going to make you wonder though to the extent that you may not be able to follow that law?
No, I don't think so. I think the prosecution's still going to have to prove to me that he was driving while intoxicated.
Mr. Bird, what do you think?
They have to prove he's innocent. I mean, he's guilty, he doesn't have to prove he's innocent.
Okay. Is it going to bother you if he doesn't take a stand? You're going to follow the law, aren't you? Ms. Ford?
I feel the same way.
Mr. Burleson, what do you think about that?
Well, I don't know why he didn't want to get up there unless he had something to hide. You can use an interpreter or something like that.
Okay.
Everybody knows he's not an American.
Okay.
You know, he's not going to put a bag over his head to hide that from us.
No, and I'm going to tell you he's not, and we certainly not going to try to hide that. Do you think that knowing that the way you feel is going to influence your ability to follow the law? You've expressed a pretty strong opinion, I think, that he ought to take a stand.
Well, yeah, I did. I think it's going to take a heck of a lot to show me that he had a good reason not to take the stand, or that he's going to start off with a mark against him.
Okay, and the law says that you can't hold that against him. What you're telling me is you just can't follow that law.
Oh, does the law say that?
Yeah.
Well, I guess if I had to.
Well, again, you're going to have. It's up to you to be honest. I can't get inside your mind. Do you think that you can follow that law fairly and impartially?
5 minutes.
Thank you, sir.
I don't know. If it comes to a point where I think it's obvious that he could get up and clear something up after talking and he doesn't, then I'll probably not give him the benefit of the doubt. If that's what I have to do, then I probably can't do that.
Challenge. Approach the bench and challenge the cause.
Good. Do you want to try to relook at the corruption?
I thought we were going to approach the bench.
Well, let's assume we're in.
Okay. Mr. Burleson, you've heard me talk about what the law is. Wouldn't you agree with me that one of the only ways that we can make this system work is if you follow the law and everyone follows it?
Sure.
And the reason why we're here is because the state has accused the defendant of not following one of our laws.
Right.
So you think that following the law is a very important thing to do. And I've told you, as has Mr. Morris, that a defendant is presumed innocent.
Right.
And that a defendant does not have to take the stand in his own defense. You understand that? That's what our laws are. Now, keeping that in mind, that the state has to prove its case, that the defendant is presumed innocent, and that the defendant does not have to take the stand. And if you're instructed in that law, as I think you will be, don't you think that you can follow that law? That you won't hold it against the defendant if he doesn't take the stand?
To me, I can't even think about whether he took the stand or not. I mean, I can't even.
It means that just because the defendant has not taken the stand, that you can't use that against him. That you listen to the evidence that's presented during the trial and find from that evidence whether the defendant is guilty or not.
I could probably do that.
Okay. We've talked about how you believe it's important to follow the law.
Right.
Given that, given what we've told you the law is, isn't it a fact that you would follow the law and not hold it against the defendant should he not take the stand? Would you do that?
I guess I would.
Okay. Would you do that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mr. Burleson, you don't appear to me to be a man that changes his mind. You appear to me to be a man that has pretty strong convictions that are thought out over a long period of time. And you're not the kind of person that's going to be wishy-washy about something like that. You told me just a few minutes ago that you couldn't follow the law. Now you're telling me you can,
Well, I guess the law had not all been explained to me.
Yeah, maybe I didn't do it very
Will
good.
it be later on, will I get more clarification in the trial that way?
Well, let me see if I can do this again. You told me that you thought somebody that didn't testify might have something to hide.
I do think that.
And you told me that when you got back there and started deliberating, that if they didn't testify, you couldn't give them the benefit of the doubt.
That's right. If what you're needing now is a guarantee that that's not going to enter my mind and that that's not going to affect my decision, I can't give you that guarantee.
Tell me, Carl.
Mr. Burleson, I'm going to instruct you that you cannot consider the imperfect fact that the defendant doesn't take the stand if he doesn't. If I instruct you that way, you can follow that instruction, can't you?
I could try.
So I could hear it again.
Object to the court's action.
All right, I'd like to ask each of our visitors, if you had only one strike, whom would you strike and why? And then I'd like to ask Sharon and Gerry to give you a little bit of their philosophy on Voir dire.
Yes,
Sharon, who would you strike?
I would strike Mr. Burke.
Why would you strike Mr. Burke?
Maybe anybody who's been stopped for DWI and let go and all the statements he made, he's just going to be on the defendant's side.
Doesn't trust the intoxicant.
That's right. Hates the intoxilizer, thinks that police officers pick on him.
Jerry?
Let's strike that asshole.
Actually, I should have granted it. Assume I did, didn't I?
Which asshole?
Assume I granted the
No,
challenge.
had I had more time, the next thing I was going to say is, of course, the defendant is going to take a stand in this case, is because he wants to tell you what happened. And so the whole purpose of going through all that was try to get you off the jury, because I figured that you were going to do that, going to take issue with that. And very much in character, I think that fit right in with the rest of the things you told me. And also, let the jury up for what a struggle it is to appear to be credible when you're a defendant.
Sharon, you want to share with students what your philosophy of Voir dire is, what you're trying to accomplish?
Well, done 2 DWI Voir dires for real, so this is like 2.5. So I haven't completely baked up my philosophy yet, but I think in this case there wasn't very much bad driving. So I wanted to talk to them about ways that you can identify someone who's intoxicated when they're not terrible drivers. So my theory was to get them to talk about the indications of intoxication and show that it's not any one thing, it's a series of little things all added together, including an intoxilizer, that can lead you to the conclusion that someone is intoxicated. And in doing that, I wanted to identify people's feelings about driving while intoxicated. It's been my experience that whether you think a right or wrong is the filter through which you look at all the evidence. And you weigh it one way or the other. So I try to ask a lot of questions about that.
Sure.
The hardest thing to do with Voir dire is get people to talk to you. And one purpose is to try to build up some rapport where people will come out of themselves a little bit, or come out of the shell that we're all in that kind of situation, and show you a little bit of who they are. Because you've got a juror in mind that is a perfect juror for a particular case, and you want to find out which are those jurors. And there's no way you can do it unless you establish a dialogue. And then there are several hot issues in the DWI case, like Sharon said, how people feel about drinking, experience with DWI-related offenses. One question that I didn't ask is, one of you had a relative that was a law enforcement officer. He blabbed on ad infinitum about how everybody's drunk that has a wreck. There were several. One thing that if you can do in a case, I think Voir dire is darn near as important as the evidence as far as whether or not you win your case. Every case that I've ever been successful in or been around that's been successful has had the feeling coming out of Voir dire that it was going to be successful because of beforehand with the jury. In this case, I think that there's a good opportunity to set the jury up where they're leaning your way a little bit, because nobody wants to think, most people, let's say, don't want to think of themselves as being prejudiced. And it's a real good opportunity to show that you're not by acquitting somebody that you ought to be prejudiced against, which is in Nicaragua in this day and age. They sort of set that up to get the jury leaning a little bit. And if you can get started leaning just a little bit, then hopefully the evidence will help you out. That's the general theory, is find out who you are and seize on an issue that'll start people leaning your way. Test them on the theory of the case. There's a lot of sub-theories.
Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, what was the legal basis for your objection?
She was interjecting prejudicial material in front of the jury that was not related to this case or relevant to this case. She was about to tell about somebody that killed in a DWI-related accident, and that's just simply not relevant, and it's inflammatory, and shouldn't be.
Yeah, when do you have a feeling, or where do you draw the line as to a person's testimony before dire, so that you get the skunk out of the jury box, take them up to talk to the judge? I mean, y'all were talking to some people who were saying a lot of stuff that might set the other jurors to thinking about things that you don't want to think about.
I want to preface my answer to that by saying it's one person's opinion, but my opinion has changed recently. When I first started trying cases, my opinion was that if you let the skunk in, you were sunk. And there may be some skunks. Certainly there's some skunks that you don't want in. Little lady raised her hand and said, I know him, he robbed me 3 years ago. That's something that you can't let in. But there are some skunks, for instance, if you had taken an extreme position on drinking, I would have probably drawn that position out of you until everybody on the jury was saying, gosh, I don't want to be like that guy. Look what a spectacle he's making of himself. And this is not something I came up with. I spent some time talking to a very good trial lawyer that I'd watched do a voir dire, and that's what he told me. He said, what do you think these people are? Just blank sponges when they come in here? That they've all got bias and prejudice, and those skunks are already there. You got to find out what skunks are there, and hopefully you can use them to your advantage, and sometimes you can't. If you get somebody that takes an extreme position, and it's a judgment call whether that particular skunk is something you want to do that on.
I think you ought to ask all the questions you can without fear of what the answer's going to be. Because there's some questions that having asked the first one, there is the next one, and you know probably the answer may not be what you want to have someone say, but I think you ought to take that chance, because you need to identify those people that are against you as early as you can and just not choose them. There's 18 to pick from, and we're doing them with 6 jurors, so there's 5 skunks, there's plenty of people left. You don't want to make the mistake of picking the person that's got that problem. Plus, I think the other thing, the skunk in the jury box stuff, most people on a jury are fairly intelligent, and they've got their feelings and thoughts on these issues, at least some. And the one comment by that skunk is not going to make them go, aha, you are so right. When I get back in that jury room, I'm going to remember that and convict this guy. They're going to talk about it, they're going to think about it, it's not going to be that easy. So it's better to know ahead of time.
Any other questions?
I'm sure when you challenge for cause, do you have to, are you sure that you're going to be sustained, and how do you weigh that against alienating the jury?
Well, I would say generally, if you make a hard run and challenge somebody for cause, you better strike them. Because there's exceptions to that, but generally, if you're challenging for cause, they take a pretty extreme position. And not only are you disagreeing with that position, you're trying to get a judge to hold it's an illegal position to hold in this case.
So you've already, you're just trying to save a strike, in other words, but it's
Yeah.
going anyway one way or the other.
Yeah, that's again a judgment call on my part, but I just really don't feel comfortable leaving somebody on the jury unless something unless I get the feeling that it's okay, but most of the time when you challenge somebody for cause, you pretty much alienate them.
Generally, at the point of having said, go on and ditch your pregnancy or something, but you can't,
Yeah.
they won't do it.
In my very first jury trial, I admonished everyone to tell me how they really felt. Well, one guy volunteered to tell me how he really felt and asked if he could come up and talk to me about his feelings at the bench. Well, his feelings were good, mostly, but some of the things he said I didn't like, and I questioned him about it. And then he went back and sat back in the jury. And I had 2 co-counsels with me that day, and they convinced me that I should put this guy on the jury, even though in my gut I felt this guy doesn't like me. Who cares what he thinks? He just doesn't like me. He shouldn't be on my jury. Well, he was on the jury, and the first vote listening to the door was 5-1 to convict. 3 hours later was 0-6 to let him go. And the one person who convinced those 5 people was that guy. So, my feeling is if you don't like them, if you don't think they like you,
You'll never disregard your intuition again.
Yeah, another war story along the same line is, I think there's a case that you and I tried. As a matter of fact, I wound up in more dire by saying, is there anybody who just has something they want to say? The guy held his hand up, went up to the bench, and just clenched and shaking, and he said, what did you like to say? He said, I don't like you, I don't like the defendant, and I think defendants get off too easy, and I just shouldn't serve on this jury. And of course, challenge the cause, but that was the very last question that I asked, and I had no inkling to that point that this guy was psychotic.